I remember back in 2012 when I was walking through the supermarket with my mom and I saw a big stand full of vegetable seeds. And I love to eat toasted tomato sandwiches. So I thought, hey, might as well get some beefsteak tomato seeds and see if I can grow myself some fresh, juicy beefsteak tomatoes to put on those toasted tomato sandwiches. And here I am 8 years later, still trying to grow those perfect, juicy beefsteak tomatoes in my front yard garden. Over the years, I've gotten better and better at growing huge crops of juicy beefsteaks. So if you're tired of growing small, pathetic tomatoes, or you just want to up your tomato growing game, this is the video for you. The first thing you want to think about when growing beefsteaks is variety. So you want to choose a variety that you know is going to do well, particularly in your climate and area. I live in Zone 5B, which is a somewhat cooler northern climate, so I like to choose varieties that have a very short days to maturity, which means that from the day you plant the transplant to the day you pick the actual tomatoes is relatively short. I use a variety called Big Beef. It's a hybrid variety and it does very well in my area. I think it does well in a variety of climates, particularly northern climates like me, because it's an early ripener. Another thing that's important when growing beefsteaks is to choose really strong, healthy plants. So if you're getting your plants from the nursery, pick out nice, stocky seedlings that look healthy but don't have any flowers on them just yet. If you're growing your beefsteaks from seed, which I highly recommend and I always do, you want to do the same thing. Choose the plants to go into your garden that are the strongest and healthiest. This will guarantee that you'll get the best yields possible. Like any plant, beefsteaks need some basic things to survive and thrive, like sun, water, and nutrients. First, let's talk about sun. Beefsteaks are a plant that needs full sun, so this means 8 to 10 hours of sunlight each day. If you can't provide this, it is possible to grow beefsteaks, but they probably won't get as big and produce as much. So I'd recommend choosing the sunniest possible spot in your garden. It'll also reduce your chances of getting disease because sunlight evaporates dew and water on your plants, which could lead to fungal and bacterial diseases. Now let's talk soil. If you want to grow the best beefsteak tomatoes, you got to make sure your soil is awesome. There's 3 basic elements that your tomatoes need to thrive, and that is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you look on any organic or inorganic fertilizer, you should see 3 numbers. This is the NPK ratio, or nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratio. Look for fertilizers that have some nitrogen, but have a higher amount of phosphorus and potassium. This is because nitrogen is used for leaf growth, whereas phosphorus and potassium is more important for flowering and fruiting. If you have too much nitrogen, what will happen is your plants will just produce a whole bunch of leaves and they won't produce as much fruit as they could. So you're probably wondering, Lucas, how exactly do you feed your plants? In the spring, I dug in some cover crop which I had planted the previous fall. This helps build the organic matter in my soil and provides lots of food for the microorganisms, which will in turn help feed my tomato plants. Also added some sheep manure compost, some bone meal, sphagnum peat moss, and some organic compost that contains mycorrhizae. Now mycorrhizae is just a fungi that enhances the root's ability to absorb nutrients. You can also buy mycorrhizae in the form of a powder, and when you plant your plants out, all you got to do is sprinkle a bit on the roots and then plant it in the ground, and that'll just help the plants take up those various nutrients throughout the season. Apart from that initial addition of organic nutrient sources, I did use some inorganic fertilizer throughout the season. Now, a lot of gardeners will say that it's bad to use inorganic fertilizers on your plants because they get absorbed into the fruits and it basically defeats the purpose of growing your own vegetables. I do agree with this thought process, and next year I hope to revert to organic methods. But the thing is, I had some Miracle-Gro in my garage. I just thought instead of spending more money on fertilizers, I'll just use what I have and then go from there. So at the beginning of the season, I watered my plants in with a dose of high phosphorus Miracle-Gro bloom booster fertilizer, and then every couple of weeks I would apply that same fertilizer until the plant started flowering. For a couple of weeks I started applying that same high phosphorus fertilizer solution, but then once the plant started setting flowers and fruit, I switched over to a higher phosphorus fertilizer, which is the Miracle-Gro tomato plant food, because this one is a lot higher in potassium, which is important for fruit development. So overall, for my nutrients this year, I used kind of a hybrid organic inorganic method, but like I said, I hope to get into 100% organic next year. We'll see what I can do. Okay, I'm getting thirsty, so let's talk about water. Irrigation is super critical when it comes to growing really big, juicy tomatoes. If you don't have a very good watering schedule for your beefsteak plants, the tomatoes probably won't get that big, and also the plants won't produce as much as they could. Because I was tired of watering by hand, this year I decided to dig into my garden budget and build a fully automatic irrigation system. Now, I've talked about this drip irrigation system in some of my other videos, but basically it's just a network of tubing that delivers water directly to the plant roots. So this is a very efficient and effective way of doing it, and I have it set on a timer, so basically I don't have to do any work in that regard. At the start of the season, when the beefsteak plants were young, I had the system going on, I think every couple days or so, just to ensure that they're getting a good supply of water to get those roots developed and start growing really strong and healthy. Then a few weeks later, once the plants started to grow vigorously, I started watering about once a week with the system. So what this does is it allows the soil to almost dry out between waterings. This will force the roots of the plants to go deeper into the ground. And if you have roots going deeper into the ground, it forces the plant to really toughen up, and if it's tough, it can support more fruit later on in the season. So once my plants started setting a lot of flowers and fruits, I switched it over to an everyday water. Every morning at 7 a.m., I had the plants being watered for 12 minutes. So this would give them about 1.4 gallons of water per week. And then with my fertilizing, each week I deliver about 0.1 gallons of water just with the water soluble fertilizers. So that kind of totaled out to 1.5 gallons of water per week per plant, which is kind of in the ideal range. I've Googled it, and apparently the ideal amount of water for tomato plants when they're setting fruit is about 1 to 2 gallons of water per week. So this might seem pretty complicated, but basically you just want to give your plants good sunlight, good nutrients, good watering, and also another thing that I didn't mention is spacing. Spacing your plants a good distance apart is critical if you want high production and also to minimize diseases. The amount of space you put between your plants depends on the support method you're using and also the method of pruning you're using. So there's lots of different methods, but basically if you're not going to prune your tomatoes and you're just growing them kind of up a cage, kind of willy-nilly, you want to give them about 3 feet of space between plants. This will ensure that there's adequate airflow and also that the sunlight can get into all those different parts of the plants and dry out the plants after a dewy morning, which will prevent disease. Basically, I think for unpruned plants that you're just growing up a cage, like this one I have behind me, you want to give them about 36 inches or 3 feet of space. And for single-stemmed pruned plants, you want to give them about 2 feet of space. But these are not hard and fast rules. You should experiment yourself with different spacings because different tomato plants, different varieties, grow differently depending on the area you're growing in, nutrient levels, etc., etc. So just experiment with different spacings and see kind of how big your plants get. Go by that. Another thing you should think about with regards to tomato plant spacing is sun scald. So what happens is if you plant your plants too far apart, sometimes the tomatoes themselves will be exposed to a lot of sunlight, and that'll cause them to actually burn. So they'll get kind of this whitish hue on the actual fruit themselves, and this part will be inedible and it'll basically ruin a lot of your fruit. So you want to ensure that your plants are not too far apart, that they're getting, too much exposure to direct sun, but also not too close that they're just, growing into each other and choking each other out. Another common issue with growing beefsteak tomatoes is blossom end rot. Now, blossom end rot is when the end of your tomatoes will get this kind of black rotted spot, and this is common if your watering schedule is kind of inconsistent and if you don't have adequate calcium in your soil. From what I've read online, blossom end rot, or BER for short, is something that's caused by a lack of calcium uptake in your plants. And even if you have enough calcium in your soil itself, if you're not watering consistently, the calcium just can't be taken up into the plants effectively. All right guys, so that's it for this video. I hope you picked up some insights on how to grow better beefsteak tomatoes. It's a really rewarding thing to do, and if you really learn to master it, you can get some really beautiful tomatoes, and they're so expensive at the store these days and they don't taste good. And if I can grow them in my own front yard, I think you can too. So get out there, plant some beefsteaks, follow some of my tips I use maybe, and hopefully you get the best results you've ever had. I'm Lucas, and I'll see you next time.